In the year 536, the sun went out. Not for a day, not for an eclipse that passed in minutes. For over a year, across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, people looked up at a sun that gave almost no light and almost no warmth. A pale, dim disk hanging in a sky that had forgotten how to be blue. They didn't know why. They had no way to know. All they knew was that the light had changed, the crops were dying, and something was terribly wrong with the world. A man was alive to write it down. His name was Procopius, a historian in Constantinople, and what he recorded has survived for 1500 years. He wrote that the sun gave its light without brightness, like the moon, for the entire year. A Roman statesman named Cassiodorus described the same thing from a different corner of the empire. A sun gone strangely blue, stripped of its usual strength, casting a sickly light over a frightened world. For a long time, historians read these accounts and weren't sure what to believe. It sounded like myth, like the kind of thing frightened people exaggerate, but we now know they weren't exaggerating at all. If anything, they were understating it, because 536 is now considered, by serious historians and scientists, a leading candidate for the single worst year in all of human history to be alive. Let me show you how we know, and what it actually did to the people living through it. It began with a mountain. Somewhere in the northern hemisphere, the exact location is still debated, possibly Iceland, possibly North America. A volcano erupted with staggering force. But this wasn't the kind of eruption you see in a documentary, all lava and drama. This was worse, precisely because it was invisible. The eruption blasted enormous amounts of sulfur and ash high into the stratosphere, so high that it spread around the entire planet and stayed there. It formed a veil, a thin, global curtain of particles that reflected the sun's light back into space before it could ever reach the ground. The Earth, quite literally, was put in shadow, and the temperature fell. Across Europe, average summer temperatures dropped by around 2.5 degrees Celsius. That number sounds small. It is not. In a world with no reserves, no global trade, no safety net of any kind, 2.5 degrees is the difference between a harvest and a catastrophe. In China, it snowed in summer. Think about that. Snow falling on crops in the months that were supposed to feed everyone through the winter. The crops failed. Not in one region, almost everywhere at once. And here is where the horror becomes real, because a failed harvest in the ancient world was not an inconvenience. It was a death sentence issued to entire populations. People had no way to store years of food. They ate what the land gave them each season. When the land gave nothing, there was nothing. Famine spread across continents. People who had lived their whole lives on the edge of enough were pushed over it, all together, in the same terrible year. And starving people do not stay peaceful. As the food ran out, order broke down. Communities that had shared and traded turned on each other. People took up arms, not for glory, not for conquest, but for the last stores of grain. Hunger did what hunger always does. It turned neighbors into threats. But the volcano wasn't finished with the human race, because the cold and the famine were only the opening act. In the year 541, just 5 years later, something arrived that would make the darkened sun look merciful. Bubonic plague reached the port of Egypt and began to spread through the weakened, starving, crowded populations of the empire. We call it the Plague of Justinian. It moved through a world that had already been brought to its knees, and it killed on a scale that is almost impossible to imagine. In the Byzantine Empire, it is estimated to have killed around a third of the entire population. Sit with that fraction. Not a distant tribe, not a single city. Roughly 1 in 3 human beings across an entire empire, gone. Cold, then hunger, then war over the last of the food, then plague. All of it flowing from that single darkened sky. This is why historians don't call 536 a bad year. They call it the beginning of one of the worst periods to be alive in the history of our species. The cooling didn't lift in a season. It settled in. What scientists now call the late antique Little Ice Age stretched on, by some measures, for Over 100 years. Now here's the question you should be asking. If this happened 1500 years ago, before science, before records as we know them, how could we possibly know it's true, and not just a frightened legend? The answer is that the Earth kept its own diary, and we finally learned how to read it. Trees, it turns out, remember. Every year a tree grows a ring, and in a good year, that ring is wide. In a starved, sunless, freezing year, that ring is thin, a scar in the wood. A scientist named Ulf Bündgen studied thousands of these tree rings across the world and found the exact fingerprint of catastrophe. A cluster of brutal years starting in 536, with more damage in 540 and 547. The trees had recorded the disaster while it was happening, and they held on to that record for 15 centuries, waiting for someone to ask. And there was a second diary. Ice. In Greenland and Antarctica, snow falls and freezes and never fully melts, trapping a thin layer of the world's air in every year's ice. Drill down through that ice and you drill down through time. When researchers pulled up cores from these ancient layers, they found it, the chemical signature of massive volcanic eruptions, sulfur locked in the ice, dated precisely to the years the trees had marked and Procopius had described. 3 separate records. A man writing by candlelight in Constantinople, the rings of trees, and the frozen breath of the planet, all pointing to the same catastrophe, in the same years. They were not exaggerating. The sun really did go dark. The world really did nearly come apart. And this is the part that should stay with you after this video ends. Everything that happened in 536. The cold, the failed crops, the famine, the collapse of order, even the way the plague spread. None of it was caused by human beings. There was no war that started it, no empire to blame, no decision anyone made. It was one mountain, somewhere, doing what mountains occasionally do. A single geological event, indifferent and enormous, that reached across the entire planet and nearly ended the people living on it. We like to think we're in control now. We have satellites watching every volcano. We have science that can read tree rings and ice cores and name the culprit. But the eruption that caused all of this could happen again tomorrow, and all our knowing would not stop the sky from going dark. We would simply understand, in real time, exactly what was killing us. The people of 536 lived through the closest thing to the end of the world that our species has ever recorded. They had no idea what was happening to them. They only knew the sun had failed, the food was gone, and the dying had begun. And somehow, against all of it, enough of them survived that you are here to hear about it at all.